Hello, my name
Hello.
is Natalie Ryan at NMHC, and I want to welcome you all to another National Multifamily Housing Council's webinars. Today's broadcast, a conversation about rent payment data and trends across different segments, is another event in our NMHC COVID-19 resource series. Today's event will be led by NMHC's Sarah Yaussi, Vice President of Business Strategy, and Caitlin Walter, Vice President of Research. Joining them are Avail's CEO Ryan Coon and Comunidad Partners Managing Partner Antonio Marquez. Before we get going, just a few administrative notes about this call. All attending lines are muted to ensure good sound quality. We anticipate this call will last about 60 minutes. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded to the NMHC website. Please feel free to submit questions to our speakers throughout the course of this broadcast. If you have a question, please use the question box in the control panel on your screen. We have reserved about 15 minutes at the end of this discussion to respond to your questions. We will do our best to address all the questions that come in. And lastly, I will direct you to note our disclaimer. NMHC provides general information to the public, and it is not intended to be investment, medical, or legal advice. And now I will turn the presentation over to Sarah.
Great, thanks so much, Natalie. Mentioned, my name is Sarah Yaussi. I'm our Vice President of Business Strategy over at NMHC, and we're thrilled to have you join us today. Here's just a quick outline of our discussion. We're going to spend a little bit of time with a rental market overview, and then we'll get into some side-by-side comparison of rent performance data and trends for different segments of the rental market. We'll talk a little bit about future payment challenges and renter relief. So with that, I'm just going to ask our various panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their company. Ryan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I'd first like to thank Sarah, Caitlin, and Natalie and NMHC for organizing this. This is really a first of its kind webinar bringing together different parts of the rental market. A bit about me, I'm Ryan Coon, the CEO of Avail. Avail is a free platform that helps improve the lives of do-it-yourself landlords and their tenants. Currently, about 600,000 landlords and tenants from across the United States use Avail for everything from rental listings to rental payments. Because DIY landlords make up about half of the rental market, I'm excited to share insights and about this part of the market today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Antonio at the Comunidad Partners. Pleasure being here today. So I'm coming to you with a perspective and vantage point that I think is a little unique. I actually wear a few different hats. One, my day job is that I'm an owner operator of a minority and women-owned investment firm that exclusively focuses on the workforce and affordable housing throughout the country with the social impact focus. In addition, I co-found and co-chair Veritas Impact Partners, a national nonprofit addressing rental resiliency and support in vulnerable communities. And lastly, I host a working group that brings together industry leaders for positive change and solutions to the workforce and affordable housing industry, which created and sponsored a rent tracker for workforce and affordable housing.
Great, thank you. And Caitlin?
Sure, I am Caitlin Walter, Vice President of Research at NMHC. I have been working with Sarah very closely on our rent payment tracker week to week. So excited to delve in a little bit further into the rental market as a whole.
Great, thanks. Caitlin, why don't you just kick us off with a little bit of an overview of the rental market? I know you have a couple slides that we should probably share.
Sure. So just starting off, every week on the rent payment tracker, we talk about how this is just for professionally managed apartments. So just to set the stage of what the overall rental market looks like, about a little over a third of units are single family rentals, 37.9%. If we could advance to the next slide, please. And then we also have varying levels. 50 units or more comprise about 10% of the overall rental industry. So it is a varied element. And moving on to the next slide, if we can advance. So we also the rent payment tracker does not include affordable units. And so we were able to get some information from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. They actually publish some data on LIHTC, tenant-based Section 8 is what it's called, project-based Section 8, public housing, and USDA multifamily. And so tenant-based Section 8 is a little over 2 million units. LIHTC are about 2.4 million occupied units. So again, these are all elements of an overall rental industry that's about 43 million units, I believe. So getting on.
Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. So as soon as we get our slides up, we can we'll share them. But sorry to interrupt, Caitlin.
No, that's quite fine. Given that, we are trying to, we wanted to present some data, so we brought in Ryan and Antonio because they're looking at both sides, some other elements in addition to the professionally managed side of things. So yeah, we can just leave up this slide up. So I'll start off with NMHC's rent payment tracker. This is something we do with our 5 data providers, Resman, Entrata, Yardi, RealPage, and MRI Software. And so we started it in April. And so we are tracking the percentage of occupied professionally managed apartment households that make at least a partial or full payment of their rent. And so this is about 11.5 million units of professionally managed apartments. So they tend to be the bigger apartment properties. So just real quick for this first week of July, we had a payment rate of 77.4%, which we noted on our webinar yesterday. A lot of that was an artifact of the fact that it was a holiday weekend, and it's not atypical for payments to be a bit lower on the holiday weekend. And so they've already started to increase again. But again, that's just one segment of the overall universe. So I guess first let's start off with Ryan for your additional part. And I should mention, these are not apples to apples, but they are 3 segments of the industry that I think it's important to know about.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. And here at Avail, as a quick background, we process payments each month for tens of thousands of individual renters across the country. Beginning back in March, beginning in March, we started really tabulating what payments were being made on time in full, partial payments, et cetera, really for these more main street landlords, not necessarily the institutional part of the market. I think our takeaways as we look at the data is that the payment rate has actually stayed relatively consistent. The trends largely mirror NMHC and what Antonio and his group are seeing. So I think it's really interesting just looking at the consistency here between the different groups on the slide.
Yeah, Antonio, can you just tell us a little bit about your tracker and the sort of genesis of that before we get into the actual data?
Yeah, I mean, really the genesis was inspired by NMHC. So I mean, I commend NMHC for coming out with a national first of its kind rent tracker. And it's really been a beacon and really kind of a great benchmark. And so because we wanted to start at that baseline at a national level, the working group that I host represents a broad swath of institutional investment firms, all focused in workforce and affordable housing. And so there are nuances to the data, right? So there can be a broad baseline, but we really wanted to understand the underlying trends in workforce and affordable housing specifically, and doing that through best-in-class operators, top 10. Those groups represent around 200,000 units that they own, manage, and control. So we wanted to create an index similar to the Dow Jones, if you will, at least for workforce and affordable housing as a proxy. So that was a little bit on our methodology. Affordable, which would be naturally occurring affordable, and then in addition, subsidized affordable, Section 8 housing choice vouchers and project-based rental assistance, and then also Section 42 and home grant with through the LIHTC. So it was, again, a diverse base of affordable and workforce housing.
Yeah, and I should just add, there may be a little bit of an overlap between our tracker and some of Antonio's units for the naturally occurring affordable, most likely.
Ryan, can you just tell us a little bit? I know that when we were talking originally, you had mentioned that some of your payment tracking data just tends to run, collections tend to run, a certain percentage or a number of percentage points below kind of the NMHC tracker in general. So could you just share a little bit of that for context?
Yeah, of course, Sarah, and that's 100% true. And I think it really has to do with the types of individual landlords that we work with here at Avail. The landlords that use our product are primarily individuals like us, who are busy full-time professionals. They own properties on the side. They're not full-time focused on making sure that all of their data is fully accurate, and that all of those payments that they receive outside of our system through cash and check are always recorded. So I think that largely explains a little bit of the discrepancy here between NMHC data along with Avail. But I think directionally it is really useful in looking at, I know that over the past couple of days, we've both looked at our data from 2020 compared to 2019, and the trends also look pretty similar across there.
Yeah, I think it's been, that's something we encountered. One of our providers mentioned yesterday that they came in and a bunch of people had entered stuff overnight. So I think that's something that happens in the professionally managed side as well. And yeah, to your point, I think what's important is that stuff is trending similar across all of the different elements.
Yeah, and I think, one thing worth noting is that, we always get a lot of questions because our data set doesn't include a lot of the affordable with the capital A as to kind of what's happening in that. So, Antonio, can you talk a little bit about why, in your data, a lot of it, it's even outperforming what our, professionally managed segment does. And so I would, if you could just spend a couple minutes explaining maybe what you see as the drivers behind that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think to start, it's sample size. And I can get into some of the other nuances that I believe is happening, but just from a quantitative objective standpoint, there's sample size that may be skewing it. I think the other piece is we don't track this as frequently as Ryan does. So his data is as real time as it gets, broad swath, a lot of owners. So it's sample size and also frequency. Our survey set only comes in every 2 weeks. So that presents, certain challenges from an accuracy standpoint. Now, beyond that, one of the purposes that we, one of the reasons that we actually created this tracker is we wanted to demonstrate institutional grade, professionally managed assets for workforce and affordable housing can outperform in a downturn, just like we're seeing now. And that was kind of the thesis, because there is, I think, some misinformation and misconceptions around workforce and affordable housing. And yes, they are vulnerable and have some challenges. But if you have the right leadership in place, they can do well.
Great, thanks. So let's just switch gears here for a second and talk a little bit about, what we might be thinking about as as we move into August and September. I think there are many of us that are pretty concerned about whether we'll be running into some payment challenges going forward. We know that there are, stimulus money and the expanded federal unemployment benefits. Definitely when we're looking at these numbers are, helping people prioritize their rent and meet their obligations. So Caitlin, I want to turn it over to you because you have some interesting data here along these lines.
Yeah, so if we could advance to the next slide, please. So the Census Bureau has started, I'm still so impressed that they're doing this. So they are doing a weekly tracker. They have two actually, the Household Pulse Survey and the Business Pulse Survey. Both are incredibly useful. The Household Pulse Survey breaks things out by owners and renters. And so one of the questions that they ask is, how are you using your stimulus money? And so here we show, again, this is for all households, how they're using their stimulus money. And so you can see almost 2/3 are using it for food, about 1/4 are using it for rent, and utilities is another large line item. So again, it's showing that the stimulus money really is going to meet basic needs. So again, a helpful metric. This is all released weekly. And then to that end, I think Ryan, you and your folks at Avail have been doing some surveys of both your owners and your residents for similar spending patterns.
Yeah, that's right, Caitlin. And just to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, I think that through our data, one of the interesting anecdotes that we've seen that really support the census data that you just touched on, Caitlin, is that individuals really are using the stimulus money to meet their basic needs for food, for shelter. As one anecdote to really show that and highlight that, back during April, the middle of the month payments for us and through the Avail platform are typically pretty low. Payments will typically come in during those first few days of the month. But back during April, we actually saw a huge surge in mid-month payments that happened to conveniently coincide with when the $1,200 stimulus payments were being made. So I think that further illustrates that people do the right thing, and when they receive the benefits, that they're putting it towards things that it's intended for. Regarding surveys that we've done, basically since March, since the second week of March, we've consistently surveyed both our landlord users along with the renters who use the Avail platform. Within the past week or so, we've surveyed both of these populations again. And right before the holiday weekend, we were able to obtain about 3,000 responses from landlords and tenants across the country. This slide here just illustrates the breakdown of the landlord respondents. And it really does skew towards the individual owner who owns just a few rental units. And again, these landlords that are owning these properties, they are like any of the rest of us who this is really a side project for them. And so they own a couple of properties. They're really dependent on the rent payments to make their monthly mortgage payments. If you flip to the next slide, it gives a little bit of a breakdown of kind of payment methods that are being made from different, and this slide in particular touches on payment methods that landlords have seen come in. Most interestingly on this is that still almost 1/3 of rent payments are still coming in with cash. That's something that is really unique. It does align with a lot of the census data that we've seen. And then another 46% or so are paying the rent with checks. So while there has been a big push towards electronic contactless payments during this pandemic, people are still paying their rent largely through the old-fashioned methods.
And I think you had another slide here that kind of showed what the residents' responses were, and it's kind of interesting to hold them side, get a look at that too.
Yeah, this is again, there could be some discrepancy between which landlords are responding, which tenants are responding. So it's not 100% apples to apples, but Looking at the tenant side of things or the resident side of things, it really shows that those cash and check payments are still a big portion of how rent is being paid in the country. Bank-to-bank or ACH transfers are growing and gaining adoption through this, but they're certainly not where they should be, I'd say.
Great. Quick question for you guys, because we get this all the time with our rent payment tracker is, I think everybody does know that there's, as leasing offices were closed and management offices were closed, and, there was that kind of big push to online payments in many different kinds of capacities, whether that was check scanning or even, some of the solutions where it's you can kind of automatically deposit your rent checks through like a convenience store or another kind of location. So there's been a whole bunch of different types of move to digital payments, but we get asked a lot about credit card payments, and to us it's not clear whether that is demonstrating a need for cash to pay to pay rent, or whether that is also very much reflective of the fact that a lot of the owners and managers have decided to waive the normal transaction fees that go along with credit cards. And so you see people who want to like collect their points or, earn cash back or whatever. So what I'd love to hear from Antonio and you, Ryan, about what's your sense of that uptick in use of credit cards means?
Yeah, I mean, from a credit card standpoint, it's interesting. I'd say I take a step back, and I'll get to the credit card question. But when you think of just the industry as a whole, if I can be so bold as to be somewhat critical, we're late to adopt, and necessity is the mother of invention. So Ryan could probably corroborate this, but there's been significant uptake. Groups that were taking checks, physically before, now been compelled to get on automatic rent payment solutions that are out there, and there's been a lot, and the whole fintech movement has actually spurred a lot of innovation investment to make sure that there are conduits and channels that can reduce the friction of payments. So I mean, I can speak in our portfolio, we probably have 99% penetration. We were probably closer to like 90 pre-COVID, but this really pushed us to get to that 99. You still have some seniors and Section 8 that will just not plug into that. But when we look at our particular portfolio, when you think of attribution of the payments, it is heavily weighted on check and cash equivalents. And then when you actually break down this credit or debit card component, because I see those are bundled, we actually broke that down further. It's much more heavily weighted towards debit cards. So that whole that whole proclivity towards cash or cash equivalents because of subsidies is absolutely true. And I think access to credit is one thing, particularly in vulnerable communities, so that has something to do with it. But I think even beyond that, people are just watching every single cent that's coming in and paying it on necessities and not taking on more credit card debt. At least we're seeing that in our portfolio.
Great, thanks. Yeah. And okay, so I just want to move forward. I mean, while we, all of our different trackers are showing that tenants residents are pretty much taking their obligations seriously and making whatever choices they need to make to be able to, stay at home. But there's a lot of uncertainty going forward. So, Caitlin, do you want to take us back to some of that census household pulse data to talk a little bit about that feeling of uncertainty looking forward about rent payments?
Sure. So if we could move to the next slide. Okay, so again, this is from the Household Pulse Survey. And so this is, so in addition, so the Household Pulse Survey asks about if you paid your last month's rent on time, and that generally tracks similar to where all three of our trackers are, and that's for all renters. But they also ask about the renters' confidence in whether or not they'll be able to pay next month's rent. And so this is the one, we ask a lot of our panelists what keeps you up at night. This is what keeps me up at night, that this is weekly, and it has continuously been a third since we are now about a month into the household pulse tracker, and it has been consistently been that a third of renters have either no or slight confidence about whether or not they're going to be able to make next month's rent. So then I look at the fact that you know, all the assistance is largely set to disappear come July 31, and it just makes me super nervous about our ability for those tracker numbers to look like they do going forward if a third of residents have you know, little confidence in that they can pay, and they already were using their stimulus stuff for basic necessities.
Great. And Ryan, I think your latest survey asked a little bit about some of those kind of income disruptions that you know, we're all very concerned about. And I agree with Caitlin that it's been sort of shocking that we can see the unemployment numbers where they are, and yet you know, we have rent payment percentages that are pretty good, even compared to last year, which you know, was a very high point in our economic cycle. And so, Ryan, would you like to share your next set of data?
Yeah, I think looking at the next few slides here, this one that's currently on the screen actually measures, and this is again based on survey data over the past week. It really shows that about 62% of people who responded to the survey had unfortunately been impacted by the COVID pandemic and had their income disrupted. The bar chart here on the right really shows the extent to which their income has been affected, and tries to kind of bucket that a little bit. If we move on to the next slide, I think it's really important considering 62% of people have been affected, had their income affected, but only 10% or so are currently on some sort of rent deferment plan. So I think the two of these combined, Sarah, speak to exactly your point, where looking ahead to August and September, when the stimulus funds are scheduled to cease, I think that's when we could unfortunately see some big ramifications on rent payment rates.
Antonio, I know a lot of your survey data didn't get into resident challenges this way, but at the same time, you have received a lot of feedback from residents, and so I was hoping that you might be able to share some of those anecdotes about kind of the realities. While people are able to make rent, like it's tough, and there's a lot of effort that's going into it. So, you know, whatever you would share would be fantastic to hear. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, I'd love to share. So on 2 points, with respect to the confidence and ability to pay next month. So this information tracks with a lot of what we're seeing, but also I think part of this is also looking at some of the nuance, particularly in workforce and affordable housing. Our tenants, our constituents, are predominantly Latino and Black renters, and the data, there was a research that came out from Urban Institute that 44% and 41% of Latino and Black renters respectively said that they had no or slight confidence that they could pay their rent next month. So that very much is keeping us awake at night. And then with respect to income, more than half of Hispanic at about 58%, and then Black renters at 53% experienced a decline in employment income. So that's about almost 15% higher than the market average. So yeah, these are concerning statistics, and I think, you know, part of this is having engagement, having a relationship with your resident. A lot has been done from a subsidy standpoint. We'll see if there's more to come. But I think, you know, we're hearing from the data some of the concerns that may be forthcoming, and I can also speak to our working group. 2 weeks ago, we and our working group has industry leaders, so industry leaders from the legislative and capital markets to ESG to owner-operator and investment firms. But the voice that we did not have on those calls, and the most important one, is the resident voice. So 2 weeks ago, we and I personally talked to about a dozen renters to just understand their circumstance and challenges, and we had a couple that joined us. And you know, part of what was so interesting to me is some did not even know that that CARES Act existed, for instance, or that there was unemployment insurance, much less that it's, you know, going to potentially expire here. And you know, what you were also showing in terms of the household pulse survey and the spending patterns, that matches up with the data that was shared earlier, and also the stories that we're hearing from our residents. I mean, the questions were around, how do I eat? How do I drive? Even if there are job openings, how do I get to that interview? I don't know if I can pay for my telephone bill next month. How can I even have an interview or even inquire on a job if I don't have telephone? And internet is also an issue. So, and notwithstanding, many residents experience illiteracy or even language barriers. So leading them to water is our role, I believe, as an industry, as ownership groups, as management groups, and supporting them, and really almost being a resident ambassador at this time, because there are resources out there. Yes, they're ebbing and flowing, and you know, some wells are deeper than others, but it's very important to have that dignity and that communication with residents in this time. And that's kind of the common thread that we learned with all you know, the residents that we talked to. Letty Beltran was a mother of 2 that works in hospitality. She was laid off, but just recently got hired back on again. Sonia Shorters, she just got her job back, but was concerned with the new outbreak and wondering what happens, you know, after unemployment insurance runs out. So a lot of these stories kind of line up with the data, and I think it's just very illustrative of the deep, you know, challenges that exist right now, and could get worse if there isn't support in the future.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things kind of complicating that look into the future is also that we have a lot of these eviction moratoriums that are you know, that are being lifted, others that are being extended, and then some of that activity is actually out of lockstep with some of the more multifamily mortgage forbearance limitations, and well, not limitations, but there are limitations around some of those policies that are not always aligned, and you know, they don't cover the whole market and all that. So there's an added layer of complexity around just these, you know, ability to pay issues. I want to take a step back to a little bit of what Ryan was talking about with these payment plan options, and I guess, you know, we're now at the point a lot of folks have deferred, who did defer. You know, it's now time to almost start paying back, and I guess I'd love to hear from you guys as to, you know, whether you're starting to see that happen, or whether you know, we're still a month away, or you know, how does that factor into your views of what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the do-it-yourself landlords who use the Avail platform do have a lot of empathy for their tenants. And I think that while we've talked about residents doing the quote right thing by using stimulus money to pay their rent and for food and those things, landlords are also by and large doing their best to work with their residents. We've got several anecdotes that came up through our survey just about people offering different reductions in rent payments, either, you know, a 50%, a 75% reduction in rent, or fully deferring the rent until later this year. So I think a lot of landlords are doing these things, absent or kind of because there isn't this big national push for kind of rent relief programs. That being said, I think unfortunately landlords do have to still pay their mortgage. and not all mortgages are backed by Fannie and Freddie. And those are the ones that have the forbearance. And so I think it's largely the non-Fannie Freddie backed mortgages that the landlord really is in that really tough situation of they can't evict their renters. They largely don't want to. I mean, they're humans. They've got hearts. They want to do the right thing. They're just in a really tough, difficult situation. And that's where I think there's some amount of leadership that needs to happen around kind of finding a good systemic solution for the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I can also share. I mean, this is at the top of industry minds. Even earlier on our working group call, we were talking about just this issue because it's an important one, because you need to address the legal implications, but also the moral and ethical ones as well. And those decisions really need to coexist, or there can be some ripple effects and a lot of unintended consequences. And I share in what Ryan is saying. I mean, not only personally, but I think, you know, all my peers. I mean, everyone wants to do the right thing and understands that there's a compassion that needs to be applied to the business elements as well, and wanting to be smart about it. And so I think the key is creating engagement, as I've talked about earlier. It's very important. I mean, this is a people business, and we can't reduce it down to what is just on a legal obligation or a lease. You just can't boil it down to that. Yes, it needs to be followed, but again, there is nuance and there's finesse and there's a relationship that should be inherent in terms of the owner manager, you know, resident dynamic. And so there's a lot of different programs and creativity going around this, as far as forgiving rent altogether or 2-year payment plans, and figuring out creative solutions to address and be concerned and compassionate and caring for residents in their situation, but also satisfying other interests, particularly if you're a fiduciary. One of the other things we talked about is the cost benefit. You know, first off, in the eviction world right now, the laws actually vary. Each jurisdiction is taking a different approach. They're backlogged. So, you know, going the eviction route, even if you're fully entitled to it, even if your lease says that you can do it, may actually be more expensive to you. It may be more time and money and weight going through a backlog system. So thinking about it from a cost benefit and keeping that tenant, particularly, you know, tenants that have been there for a long period of time, and working with them and figuring out how can I keep you in your home, provide shelter for your family, but also doing it, you know, with data, with numbers. I mean, if you just, you know, look at the turnover costs and you amortize the vacant days, and you think of the marketing costs and the 7x that it takes to get a new tenant versus keeping an existing one. You know, looking at that math long and hard will save a lot of tenants, be good for retention, be good for community building. The other piece is, you know, a lot of negative PR, so that there are concerns, especially large brand names, around that. But really just incorporating the human element of compassion into the business element of what you need to do day to day.
Great, thanks. And we've made several references to the federal relief benefits that are going to expire, and you know, NMHC has been advocating for additional renter relief going forward. But Antonio, I know that you've had a lot of experience with layering on some different kinds of relief resources. We've seen some of our members set up their own, you know, very early on. There's lots of different jurisdictions, state or local, city, that have funds available to help renters who might not be able to make their rent payments. And some of those get depleted very quickly. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, you know, what you're doing for your residents along these lines and the resources that you're kind of corralling for them. As you said earlier, you know, that's kind of one of the responsibilities that you take upon yourself is to kind of bring that information to people who might not even know where to find it, much less access it. So if we could advance maybe this first slide. I guess they got order, but Ryan, do you want to, we'll just put that on pause for a second. And Ryan, this was some of the data from your survey about different relief options. And do you want to talk, I mean, we were sort of, Caitlin and I were pretty fascinated by some of the findings there.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think one of the most fascinating things that came out of our survey is actually the how people are currently paying their rent. And one of the interesting findings here is that about 30% of people are actually already borrowing money in order to meet their rent payment obligation. And then another 30% or so said that part of their rent payment is being able to be paid because of some government funding that is being made available to them. So I think that there are avenues out there. People are, I think the thing that really stands out to me mostly though, is that people are kind of clawing and scrambling and trying to do everything that they can to meet their rent payment obligation. So that's probably the biggest takeaway here.
Great, thanks. And then I guess we'll advance again to the next slide. There you go, Antonio.
Thank you. So yeah, Sarah. So as I started in the intro, so I wear a couple different hats. I try and be a utility player, but also be intentional and focused on really providing communities. So about 2 years ago, I co-founded a nonprofit by the name of Veritas Impact Partners. So you're actually seeing one of the tools, one of the resources that we have available. 2 years ago, Veritas was providing resident support through education, health and wellness, and economic advancement and job and financial empowerment. And so a lot of that programming revolved around interactions, around people being around people, and group settings and events and support and after school programs and those types of things. And I'll even illustrate that a little bit later in this session. But what we had to do is pivot during COVID and really work in a world that's remote, it's virtual, it's digital. But we asked ourselves, well, how can we really fulfill our mission? And again, necessity being the mother of invention, how can we use technology in the nonprofit space and use some of the best practices in terms of businesses, for-profit businesses, and apply it in the nonprofit world? And hopefully we'll have better impact outcomes, especially during COVID. So what we ultimately decided is that we could have we could serve a benefit to residents through a resident resource center, basically curating the best resources that exist at the federal, state, or local level, and providing it into a format that's palatable for residents and palatable for our community managers, so that when they're having that dialogue and exchange with the resident, not where is your rent, but how can I help you support your family? How can I help you get a job? How can I help you get CARES Act money and get the subsidies? Because I'll tell you, frankly, as we started to put together this resource center that you're seeing, it was tough for me and my staff. I mean, master's degrees and PhD. I mean, very, very educated, informed individuals, and it was a struggle for us even to piece it together. So imagine a family of 4 that just lost a job, struggling to pay basic necessities, having to go out and identify and synthesize this information. So that's what we did. And what you're seeing here is just a national resource page, and we focused on health and wellness, which is what you're seeing, so that residents can get access to health. We also started a telehealth initiative, which I'll talk about in a minute here. But we also, and early on, I didn't realize that food would be such a critical issue, and it turned out to be a major one, as we're seeing in the data. But very early on, it was food security. and just, getting access to food. Like I said, some of our residents can't even afford their car bills anymore, or to put fuel in their vehicles. So getting mobile delivery of food is essential. It's critical. It's vital to life for a lot of residents. And then we also did a federal stimulus piece with the COVID calculator, which I'll talk about in a second. And if we could advance to the next slide. These are just the state resources. So just to demonstrate, we had federal, and then we filtered down to the state level. And then we also did local level. And there were, one of the issues, one of the mistakes that we made initially is, how do you keep this information fresh and relevant? And so we were thinking, well, let's call up these organizations and figure out what's going on and what are they offering. That proved to not be scalable, but also not accurate. I mean, a lot of these nonprofits and organizations that are supporting residents in need, or anyone in need, are backlogged themselves. We couldn't get through to them through phone lines. So we had to, again, invent ourselves again and figure out how can we find this information, because it ebbs and flows, and we wanted to make sure that it was relevant and timely to our residents. So we leveraged technology. Our team at Veritas and volunteers from Thrive started to filter through Google alerts, Twitter, Facebook feeds. We actually started to extract the data from a lot of these organizations, because we had all the organizations, we just didn't know who had funding and who had available resources. So we actually combed through that data, filtered it, did keyword searches, and then kind of concentrated down into the things that we thought were important, and then that's how we're now reporting. And that was the most effective way that we could make this relevant. And we're constantly moderating it. And then the next slide should be the other part of our Resident Resource Center, which was a COVID calculator. As I mentioned earlier, it was I mean, CARES Act, HEROES Act, unemployment insurance, Families First Coronavirus Act, all these bills were coming out, which had great resources. But again, how could you decode them and translate it into something that residents can understand and utilize, because it's out there for them? And so we built a calculator with a specific algorithm going through a number of different attributes with all these acts and subsidies, all the way to SBA PPP, because some of our residents are contractors and or independent contractors rather, that have under 500 employees. Many of them are very entrepreneurial resident base as well. And so we said, if you add all these up, many residents would probably be surprised at what resources are out there, and probably more motivated to go out and access them. So that was kind of the idea, where we would have this calculator. You can see this amount was $10,200. We had the president of ADP speaking on our working group conversation earlier today, and he had an interesting statistic. 2/3 of people actually were making more than they did post-COVID than pre. So it's working, and that's also what's propped up some of the collection figures, I believe. But the point was that this tool would kind of symbiotically add value to the links that are out there as well. So if you need unemployment insurance, we have a whole unemployment insurance resource center. So it's all connected and helps people get access to resources fast. And then the next slide, please. Great. So as I was mentioning earlier, pre-COVID, Veritas was doing education. These are after-school programs, and the picture on the left was a partnership with Target and some other merchants in the local area. That was a back-to-school event where we provide backpacks, crayons, pencils, that sort of thing. And we did it with the local law enforcement as well, which was really cool to get the community out there and involved. Then the next slide. On the left, this is a senior property that we have, and we were providing Thanksgiving turkeys. Again, that relationship with residents and engagement is key. And frankly, I think it's served us well in COVID. I mean, because of those relationships, I believe we've been able to perform better than we would have otherwise, and given us a competitive advantage at Comunidad. To the right is after school programs and ESL. So again, all pre-COVID, and this is shown to illustrate, I mean, it relied on high touch. So we had to kind of evolve ourselves. And next slide, please. So now in Veritas 2.0, I think there was a slide before this. If this, okay, all right. So they were switched around. Okay, so no, that's fine. So telehealth. So what we decided to provide is to our residents free access right now to telehealth, since a lot of hospitals had gridlock and residents couldn't go, not just COVID testing, but diabetes or heart issues or anything that may occur health-wise to our residents. We want to provide access to 24/7 live doctors and support, diagnosis, and even prescriptions can be issued through this tool. And then the next slide, I think should be, okay, so food security. So as I talked about earlier, food security was important, so we hit mobile delivery of food, working with City Square and Feeding America and U.S. Department of Labor and Agriculture to actually provide healthy meals to our residents and kids. And you can see we're practicing COVID. The kids are still having fun, but we wanted, you can see that they're accessing food there separately and distancing over there on the right. And then is there one more slide on virtual fitness?
Yeah.
Okay.
It disappeared. I don't know why it was there before. But yeah, go ahead on the virtual fitness also.
Yeah, and just the last piece, I mean, we wanted to serve on the health and wellness piece. And so the wellness piece is just fitness, and particularly because, kids are home and parents are home, and we wanted to just make sure that they could get their energy out. So we would do Zumba, which was a huge hit. And it's really cool because you get like the interactivity that goes on, because it's not just the activity, but people are, typing away, or I can do this move better than you, or that's a great song, that sort of thing. So it was fantastic. We had a whole kids segment, and then we'd have the Padres section, the mom and pop section, which was a lot of fun. But again, just created a great relationship and got people active, and created a connection with the property and the management team.
Great, thanks so much, Antonio. I think it is a really important point that while we often focus on, relief and efforts from a kind of monetary perspective, there's a lot of different facets to providing the kind of support to, make people be able to kind of stay comfortably in their homes and meet their obligations too. So thank you for sharing all those. At this point, I think we can open it up to questions. I see some coming through. So maybe Caitlin, can you pick a couple out of there that seem interesting?
Yeah, and so I should mention, I haven't been sending emails this whole time. I've actually been trying to moderate some of the questions that were easily answerable. So hopefully some of you, if you posted a question, take a look and see if I was able to answer it. So Ryan, one quick question for you. How many units or how many owners does your data set, the overall tracker numbers, not the survey, represent? You're muted.
All right, great. The data set that is included in our population represents about 180,000 individual landlords. Each landlord that uses the Avail platform on average owns and manages about 1.5 units, so it represents about 300,000 total units.
Okay. And then the other question we've gotten kind of in various forms throughout this. So Antonio, obviously you talked about some resources available for the residents. We have had some landlords, either owners or property managers of varying sizes, asking about what kind of resources are there for them to, guidance. And again, I should mention, like, we can't provide legal guidance here, but any sort of resources for them to look into for how to best manage the relationship with their residents.
Yeah, there's a number of resources out there. I mean, I would start with NMHC. Frankly, I mean, NMHC's resources are it's fantastic. They've helped us navigate during these challenging times. And also NMHC has a listserv that I suggest anybody that's a member to definitely sign up, and we've been tracking that. And then there's other best practices out there. NAA has information and resources, which is good. Even some of the property management system providers like Yaussi are providing information on how to manage through this, how to do things the right way. They provided a free payment plan tool to all users, so we leverage that to help manage the payment plan tools. And then beyond that, I mean, the Resident Resource Center that we've created is free. The COVID calc, I mean, we built all that with our data analytics team. So again, that's where the for-profit side can do good. So we supported the nonprofit in terms of that build. And I'd also say, you know, just because we're in COVID doesn't mean that we're disabled from supporting people and creating that engagement. And you're seeing the tools that actually can make a difference and can connect with your residents. And not only do I firmly believe, but we can actually prove empirically, at least in our portfolio, when we did A/B testing in terms of the properties that had social impact versus not, performance was better, occupancy was higher, turnover costs were lower, NOI was better, it's more consistent. And you know, we were doing this pre-COVID specifically because not only did we believe it was the right thing to do, but also we believe it was operational insurance. Having a relationship with your residents will help you weather the storm, and having that connection with them will help you, you know, navigate this more smoothly, and frankly put residents in a better position coming out of this. I mean, right now it's survival mode and resiliency, but we ultimately want them to go from survive to thrive, and ultimately thriving when we come out of this. So, my only encouragement is to don't take a passive role, be active, you know, be caring, and leverage the resources that are out there, because they're out there. And by the way, after this, if anybody wants to communicate with me, I'm happy to share resources, you know, personally to anybody that's interested. I care about this a lot.
And Caitlin, are there any other organizations that have some of that, you know, either state level relief information that you know of as well?
I believe
difficult because some of the resources are just depleted quickly.
Yeah, I believe the National Low Income Housing Coalition has been providing some information on their website, and the Urban Institute maybe as well, but National Low Income Housing Coalition is the one I can think of. And I wanted to give Ryan an opportunity, you know, if there's anything, any ideas you have as well.
Oh, sorry, I was muted there for a sec, but I will also say that here at Avail, we've been pretty active in trying to provide resources both for owners and for renters. Those are all available on our website at avail.co/COVID-19, all one word, no hyphen. There's a lot of really good links both to different federal things that are available, along with different state and local resources as well. I know that there's a link to the Fannie Mae mortgage forbearance lookup on there that's recently become really helpful for a couple of our landlords anecdotally. So I would encourage people to check that out. Also look at NMHC. I mean, NMHC puts out a lot of really good content on the topic. So yeah, and I'll echo Antonio. I mean, I'm available. I'm more than happy to help anyone who's interested, connecting people with different resources.
Great, thanks. Caitlin, would you like to pluck another question out of the queue?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, we've had a bunch of questions about any, this is probably more, well, for both of you, actually, you know, are there any differences in terms of where geographies are operating a little different? And if you could also set the stage of kind of what I know the NMHC rent payment tracker is national. If you want that broken up for professionally managed apartments, RealPage has that data, also by class type. But if you could set the stage of what geography you're looking at, and then also if there's been any differentiation in terms of performance.
Yeah, so in our tracker, our member groups are geographically diverse. So there's no one concentration in any pocket of the country that wouldn't be representative of the industry as a whole. But what I will say is, yes, there are pockets of softness, and they normally correlate to markets that have high concentrations of industries that are vulnerable. Service sector workers, retail, workers, hospitality, tourism. So if you just look at that and transpose that on the map, that's naturally going to be Las Vegas and some other markets. Even San Diego, I'm hearing, has some softness, and that's historically been a very, very tight market. So, markets are not immune. And so I think it just kind of underscores where, the assistance needs to be and support needs to be as well. So that's just kind of the anecdotes that we found talking to different member groups. And then there's also some national data around this as well.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit from Avail. So earlier I mentioned that there's about 300,000 total units being managed with the Avail platform. Those units are spread across something like 20,000 zip codes. So it's pretty geographically diverse data that we're able to capture. And I'll echo some of what Antonio said, where I think those states or municipalities that largely rely on service and hospitality industries have been impacted this entire time, basically since March. I know that Nevada is one of the states that has been probably hardest hit during this, and then more specifically Las Vegas. What's also been interesting to track, though, is over the past few months, just what the trend has looked like. So New York was obviously one of the earliest states to be hardest hit, and that state in particular had a lower payment rate back during March and April. And what we're seeing now in June, July is actually some of the states down in the Southeast that have recently had that kind of uptick in number of cases. So I think it's been really interesting to watch those trends, and hopefully we get this whole situation under control. But I think that as people are looking at case counts, they can largely predict which properties will be impacted on the rent.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So here we are at a full hour. It flew by. And so I just want to thank you guys one more time for participating. And for anyone listening, there were a couple of questions. We do have at NMHC some additional rent payment data. Our 5 PMS partners also provide additional cuts. So there was a new Yaussi report pretty recently that looked at renters by necessity versus lifestyle renters. There were MRI just recently published a cut on affordable properties and public housing. Caitlin mentioned RealPage's different geographic and asset class breakdowns, and Entrata also does a number of other cuts also. So that is nmhc.org/rent payment tracker. And with that, I'll say again, thanks so much, guys, for joining us. This was great. You guys have to see how other different segments of the rental market are operating, and seems like we're all in somewhat of a lockstep, but each segment seems to have a little bit unique challenges at the same time. So thanks so much, and of course we'll have a recording on our website. So if you didn't catch all of it, we will be sending that out, or you can check us out at nmhc.org. Thank you.